Sherlock Holmes and a Shadow in the Gaslight. An honouring audiobook's original story from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1. The Curious Case of the Crimson Orchid. The incessant drizzle of a late October evening had painted the grimy panes of our Baker Street abode with a sheen of melancholic despair, mirroring, perhaps, the very mood that had settled upon my esteemed companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For weeks, the great detective had languished in a state of intellectual torpor, a condition far more alarming to my sensibilities than any fever or ague. His violin, usually a vibrant extension of his profound thoughts, now lay silent in its velvet-lined case. His chemical experiments, typically bubbling with noxious enthusiasm, were inert. Even the ever-present pipe, that faithful conduit of his deepest cogitations, emitted but a desultory wisp of smoke, as if contemplating its own futility. "Watson," he declared abruptly, startling me from my perusal of the British Medical Journal, "the human intellect, much like a finely tuned engine, requires constant lubrication. Without a worthy problem to dissect, it rusts, it stagnates, it becomes, dare I say, commonplace." I lowered my journal, a familiar sigh escaping my lips. "My dear Holmes, you speak as if the very fabric of London society has ceased to weave its usual tapestry of crime. Surely, somewhere within this vast metropolis, there is a villain worthy of your attention." He merely grunted, his long, slender fingers drumming an impatient tattoo upon the armrest of his favourite armchair. "The common villain, Watson, is a predictable creature. His motives are base, his methods crude. A simple burglary, a straightforward murder of passion, these are mere exercises for a junior constable, not for a mind that craves the intricate dance of the unknown." He paused, his grey eyes, usually so keen and penetrating, now clouded with a profound ennui. "No, Watson. What I require is a puzzle, a labyrinth of deceit, a crime that defies the mundane, a whisper of the truly extraordinary." As if on cue, a sharp, insistent rap echoed from the street door below, reverberating through the quiet house. Holmes's head snapped up, a flicker of something akin to anticipation, a nascent spark igniting in his eyes. "Ah, a caller," he murmured, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "And at this hour. Observe, Watson, the subtle nuances of a late-night summons. It speaks of urgency, of desperation, perhaps even of a fear that could not wait for the dawn." Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps ascended the stairs, followed by a more hesitant yet distinctly purposeful tread. The door to our sitting-room opened, and our landlady, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity, announced, "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's a matter of the gravest importance. Mr. Alastair Finch." Alastair Finch. The name was unfamiliar to me, yet it possessed a certain old-world resonance. The man who entered was indeed a gentleman, though one whose usual composure seemed to have been violently dislodged. He was of medium height, perhaps in his late 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard streaked with grey and eyes that, even from across the room, betrayed a profound agitation. His overcoat, though of fine tweed, was damp and clung to his frame, and a single exquisite crimson orchid pinned to his lapel seemed incongruous against the backdrop of his distress. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice a strained baritone, "I apologize for this unseasonable intrusion, but I assure you my predicament is of such an extraordinary nature that I felt I had no recourse but to seek your unparalleled assistance immediately." Holmes, ever the master of the subtle assessment, gestured towards a chair. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Finch. You appear to have braved the elements. A cup of tea, perhaps, to ward off the chill?" "No, thank you, Mr. Holmes," Finch replied, though he gratefully sank into the offered seat, his gaze darting nervously about the room before settling on Holmes. "My mind is far too agitated for such pleasantries. I fear I have been the victim of a most peculiar and unsettling theft." "Indeed?" Holmes's voice was calm, almost languid, yet I detected the subtle shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible sharpening of his attention. "A theft, you say? Of what nature, Mr. Finch?" Finch took a deep, shuddering breath. "Of a flower, Mr. Holmes, a single, singular orchid, the Orchidaceae rubra mysterium." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "A flower?" While any theft was regrettable, this hardly seemed the sort of grand criminal enterprise that would rouse Holmes from his intellectual slumber. Yet the man's genuine distress was palpable. Holmes, however, merely steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "A flower, Mr. Finch? And you deem this a matter of the gravest importance?" Not merely a flower, Mr. Holmes, Finch exclaimed, leaning forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. This orchid, sir, is unique. It is the only known specimen of its kind in existence. My family, the Finches of Fletcher Manor, have cultivated it for generations. It blooms but once every decade, and its petals, as you can perhaps discern from this humble representation, he touched the crimson orchid on his lapel, possess a hue so profound, so utterly unlike any other, that it is almost supernatural. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, a genuine note of interest now in his tone. And this unique specimen has been stolen from your possession. From my private conservatory, Mr. Holmes, a structure of reinforced glass and iron, secured by the most modern locks and alarms, located deep within the grounds of Fletcher Manor, miles from any public road. And yet, this morning, when my head gardener, Old Man Hemlock, went to tend to it, the pedestal was empty. Gone. Vanished without a trace. Without a trace, you say? Holmes's eyes narrowed. No forced entry? No broken glass? No disturbed soil? None whatsoever. Finch wrung his hands. The windows were intact, the doors locked from the inside. The ground around the pedestal, a finely raked bed of peat moss, was undisturbed. It's as if the orchid simply dematerialized. Dematerialized, Mr. Finch, is a concept more suited to the spiritualists than to the practicalities of criminal enterprise, Holmes said dryly. However, a theft without apparent entry is indeed intriguing. Tell me, who knew of this orchid's impending bloom? Only a select few, Mr. Holmes, myself, of course, my sister, Lady Eleanor, my head gardener, Hemlock, and a botanist of some renown, Professor Alaric Thorne, who had expressed a keen interest in studying its unique properties. Professor Alaric Thorne, Holmes repeated, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. I recall the name. A specialist in exotic flora, if my memory serves. Has he visited Fletcher Manor recently? He was a guest just last week, Finch confirmed. He spent several days examining the orchid, making sketches, taking notes. He was quite enthralled by it. He even offered a sum, a truly astronomical sum, I might add, for its acquisition. An offer I, of course, politely declined. The rubra mysterium is a family heirloom, Mr. Holmes, not a commodity to be bought and sold. And when did Professor Thorne depart? 2 days ago. He left by the morning train, expressing his gratitude for my hospitality. And since his departure, has anyone else had access to the conservatory? Only Hemlock for his daily duties, and myself for my evening inspection. No one else. We are quite isolated at Fletcher. The staff are all long-serving and utterly trustworthy. Holmes leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, a sure sign that his formidable intellect was now fully engaged. Mr. Finch, you mention this orchid blooms but once a decade. What is its significance beyond its rarity and beauty? Finch hesitated, his eyes flickering towards me. Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but this is a delicate matter. The orchid, it is believed to possess certain properties, medicinal properties, some say. Others whisper of a more esoteric influence. Esoteric influence? I interjected, my medical curiosity piqued. What sort of influence? Finch shifted uncomfortably. There is an old family legend, Dr. Watson, a rather fanciful tale, I assure you, but one that has persisted through the generations. It is said that the rubra mysterium, when consumed at the peak of its bloom, can grant a singular clarity of mind, a heightened perception. Some even claim it bestows a brief, fleeting glimpse into the future. I scoffed. Superstitious nonsense, Mr. Finch. A plant, however rare, cannot possess such powers. Perhaps not, Dr. Watson, Finch said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced by his own dismissal. But the legend persists, and it is this legend, I fear, that may have motivated the thief. Holmes, who had listened to this exchange with an almost detached interest, now spoke. A legend, however improbable, can certainly provide a motive, Mr. Finch, especially for those predisposed to believe in such things. Now let us return to the practicalities. Describe the conservatory in detail, its dimensions, its layout, the location of the orchid's pedestal. Finch, eager to provide any assistance, launched into a meticulous description of the conservatory. It was a grand structure built in the late 18th century, with a central domed section and 2 long wings. The rubra mysterium was housed in a climate-controlled chamber within the eastern wing, accessible only through a heavy oak door secured with a complex lock. The chamber itself had no windows that opened, and its glass roof was similarly sealed. And the locks? Holmes pressed. Were they tampered with? No, Mr. Holmes. The oak door was locked from the inside, as always. Hemlock, who has the only key, found it so this morning. He unlocked it, entered, and found the orchid gone. Locked from the inside, Holmes repeated slowly, a new light dawning in his eyes. This is indeed a curious detail. Tell me, Mr. Finch, is there any other way into this chamber? A ventilation shaft, a hidden passage, a service tunnel? Finch shook his head vehemently. Absolutely not. It was designed to be impenetrable. My ancestors were very protective of their botanical treasures. And the key, Mr. Finch, who possesses it? Only Hemlock, as I said. He keeps it on a chain around his neck. He is a man of impeccable character, utterly devoted to the family. He has been with us for 50 years. A chain around his neck, Holmes mused, and he would have been the first to discover the theft. Did he appear distressed? Profoundly so, Mr. Holmes. He was quite beside himself. He wept, I believe. He felt personally responsible. Indeed. And what of your sister, Lady Eleanor? What is her disposition towards this orchid and its legend? Finch hesitated again, a shadow crossing his features. Eleanor, she is a woman of a more romantic disposition, Mr. Holmes. She has always been rather fascinated by the old family tales. She believes, I think, in the orchid's power more readily than I do. And her relationship with Professor Thorne? Cordial, I suppose. They conversed at length about botany during his visit. Eleanor has always had a keen interest in natural history. Holmes rose from his chair and walked to the window, peering out into the rain-swept street. Mr. Finch, this case, while superficially simple, presents several intriguing contradictions. A theft without entry, a unique object of immense value, both monetary and, to some, mystical, and a limited circle of individuals with knowledge of its existence and impending bloom. I confess, my interest is piqued. A wave of relief washed over Finch's face. Then you will take the case, Mr. Holmes? Indeed. Watson, prepare your bag. We shall journey to Fletcher Manor at once. I nodded, already anticipating the familiar thrill of the chase. Holmes, invigorated by the prospect of a new challenge, was a man transformed. The ennui had vanished, replaced by that keen, tired, almost predatory, alertness that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. The journey to Fletcher Manor was a long and rather uncomfortable one. The train rattled through the darkened countryside, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a monotonous backdrop to Holmes's silent cogitations. Finch, still visibly agitated, offered little conversation, lost in his own anxieties. I, for my part, occupied myself with observing Holmes, noting the subtle shifts in his expression, the occasional twitch of his eyebrow, the way his fingers drummed a silent tune on his knee, all indicators of a mind working at a furious pace. It was well past midnight when we finally arrived at the nearest station, a small, desolate platform swallowed by the vast, silent expanse of the countryside. A waiting carriage, a rather antiquated brougham, was our final conveyance. The drive through the winding, tree-lined lanes was shrouded in a thick, oppressive mist that seemed to cling to the very air, lending an ethereal, almost spectral quality to the ancient trees that loomed on either side. Fletcher Manor itself was a formidable structure, a sprawling edifice of dark stone that seemed to absorb the meagre light of the moon. Its silhouette against the bruised sky was imposing, almost forbidding. As we approached, a single light burned in a distant window, a lonely beacon in the vast darkness. We were met at the grand oak doors by a stern-faced butler, a man whose demeanour suggested he had seen far too many late-night disturbances. "Mr. Finch," he intoned, his voice flat, "Lady Eleanor has retired. She left instructions that you were to be informed of the unfortunate incident, but that she wished not to be disturbed further tonight." Finch merely nodded, his shoulders slumped. "Thank you, Craggs. Please show Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson to their rooms. We will require breakfast at 7, and I wish to proceed directly to the conservatory immediately thereafter." Craggs led us through dimly lit corridors, the silence of the house broken only by the soft padding of our footsteps and the occasional creak of ancient floorboards. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and a faint, indefinable aroma that I could not quite place. Our rooms were comfortable, if somewhat austere, and offered a welcome respite from the journey. Holmes, however, showed no inclination for rest. "Watson," he whispered, once Craggs had departed, "the scent. Did you notice it?" I sniffed the air. A faint, earthy smell, perhaps, like damp soil and something floral? Precisely, Holmes said, a glint in his eye. A very specific floral scent, Watson. One that lingers despite the hour and the distance from the conservatory. It suggests a recent and significant presence of the very object of our search. But how could it linger so strongly? I asked, perplexed. Unless the thief carried it through the house. Or, Holmes mused, unless the orchid itself possesses a particularly potent fragrance, one that adheres to the very fabric of the air. A detail Mr. Finch neglected to mention, perhaps because he is so accustomed to it. A detail that could be highly significant. He then produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket and began to meticulously examine the carpet in the hallway outside our rooms, then the banister, and finally the very air itself, as if seeking invisible clues. I watched him, accustomed to his peculiar methods, knowing that even the most seemingly insignificant detail could unlock a hidden truth for his extraordinary mind. Nothing conclusive here, he finally pronounced, straightening up. But the scent is undeniable. It confirms the orchid was recently in this vicinity. Now, Watson, a few hours' rest. We shall require our wits about us in the morning. The next morning dawned grey and damp, the mist still clinging stubbornly to the grounds of Fletcher Manor. After a hasty breakfast, during which Holmes remained largely silent, consuming his toast and tea with an almost mechanical precision, we joined Mr. Finch, who looked even more haggard than the previous evening. "The conservatory awaits, gentlemen," he announced, leading us through a series of grand reception rooms, their heavy curtains still drawn against the morning light. The conservatory itself was a revelation. It was a vast, cathedral-like structure of glass and iron, filled with a riot of exotic foliage. Humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth and verdant growth, enveloped us as we stepped inside. Rare ferns unfurled their fronds, and vibrant, unfamiliar blossoms dotted the landscape of green. "The eastern wing is through here," Finch explained, leading us down a long, glass-walled corridor lined with more tropical plants. At the end stood the heavy oak door he had described, its dark wood contrasting sharply with the shimmering glass around it. "This is the chamber," Finch said, producing a large ornate key from a hook beside the door. "Hemlock's key. He leaves it here each night and retrieves it each morning." Holmes examined the key, then the lock, his fingers tracing the intricate mechanism. "A formidable lock, Mr. Finch, and no signs of tampering, as you said." "None," Finch affirmed. "It was locked when Hemlock arrived this morning. He opened it and, well, you shall see." He inserted the key, turned it with a heavy click, and pushed open the door. The chamber beyond was a smaller, more intensely humid space, dominated by a single ornate stone pedestal in its centre. The pedestal was empty. "There," Finch said, his voice thick with despair, "the rubra mysterium was here. Now, nothing." Holmes immediately began his meticulous examination. He ignored the pedestal for a moment, instead focusing on the floor around it. He knelt, producing his magnifying glass, and scrutinized the finely raked peat moss. "You said this was undisturbed, Mr. Finch?" Holmes asked, his voice low. "Completely, Mr. Holmes. Not a single footprint, not a displaced grain." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his eyes sweeping over the pristine surface. "Remarkable. And the air, Watson. The scent is even stronger here, is it not?" I inhaled deeply. The earthy floral aroma was indeed more pronounced, almost cloying in its intensity. It was a rich, sweet, yet subtly metallic scent, unlike any flower I had ever encountered. Holmes then turned his attention to the pedestal itself. He ran his gloved hand over its smooth stone surface, then peered closely at the small indentation where the orchid's pot would have rested. "The pot was of a standard terracotta, I presume?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. About 10 inches in diameter." Holmes nodded, then moved to the walls of the chamber, examining the glass panels, the iron framework, and the ceiling. He tapped the glass, listened intently, and ran his fingers along the seams. "No hidden panels," he concluded. "No secret passages. The structure is sound. Which brings us back to the central enigma. How did the orchid and its pot depart this locked chamber without disturbing the environment?" He stood in the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping slowly from floor to ceiling, as if willing the solution to materialize before his eyes. "Mr. Finch," Holmes finally said, turning to our client, "you mentioned your head gardener, old man Hemlock. I should like to speak with him." Hemlock was a wizened old man with gnarled hands and a face deeply etched by years of sun and wind. He arrived, shuffling, his eyes red-rimmed and his shoulders slumped. "Mr. Hemlock," Holmes began, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand you were the first to discover the absence of the rubra mysterium this morning." "Aye, sir," Hemlock croaked, his voice trembling. "It was a shock, it was. A terrible, terrible thing. Tell me, Mr. Hemlock, your routine. What time do you arrive at the conservatory each morning?" "Always at 6, sir. Sharp. To check the temperatures, water the delicate ones." "And you found the oak door to this chamber locked?" "Aye, sir. Just as I left it last night, locked from the inside." "And you possess the only key?" "That's right, sir. Always on my chain, never leaves me." He patted his chest, where a faint indentation was visible beneath his waistcoat. "Did you notice anything unusual last night, Mr. Hemlock? Any sounds, any lights?" Hemlock frowned, thinking deeply. "No, sir, not a thing. The night was quiet as the grave. The mist, it was thick, mind you, swallowed up all sound." "And when you entered this morning, did you touch anything before you realized the orchid was gone?" "No, sir. I just saw the empty pedestal. My heart sank, sir. It truly did." Holmes observed Hemlock closely, his eyes missing nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Hemlock. That will be all for now." As Hemlock shuffled out, Holmes turned back to Finch. "Mr. Finch, I should now like to speak with Lady Eleanor." Lady Eleanor Finch was a striking woman, perhaps a decade younger than her brother, with a regal bearing and eyes that held a certain melancholic depth. She received us in a drawing-room filled with antique furniture and the scent of dried potpourri. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted us, her voice soft but clear. "My brother has informed me of your presence. This business with the orchid is truly distressing." "Indeed, Lady Eleanor," Holmes replied, taking a seat opposite her. "Your brother mentioned your particular interest in the rubra mysterium and its associated legends." A faint, almost imperceptible blush touched her cheeks. "The legends are merely old wives' tales, Mr. Holmes. Charming, perhaps, but hardly to be taken seriously." Her denial, however, lacked conviction. "Yet you find them intriguing?" Holmes pressed gently. She sighed. "They are part of my family's history, Mr. Holmes. It is difficult not to be drawn into the romance of it all, to imagine a flower that could grant such insight." "And Professor Alaric Thorne," Holmes continued, his gaze unwavering. "You conversed with him during his visit?" "Yes, at length. He is a brilliant man, a true scholar of botany. He was quite captivated by the rubra mysterium." "Did he express any unusual interest in its properties beyond the purely scientific?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flickering away. He was certainly curious about the family history. He asked many questions about the legends, perhaps more than one would expect from a purely scientific mind." "Did he, Lady Eleanor, ever suggest a means by which one might bypass the security of the conservatory?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mr. Holmes, what a preposterous suggestion! Professor Thorne is a man of the highest integrity." "Indeed," Holmes said smoothly. "Forgive my directness, Lady Eleanor. It is merely a process of elimination. The orchid vanished from a locked room. We must consider all possibilities, however remote." Lady Eleanor composed herself. "He certainly did not. He spoke only of his admiration for the orchid and his desire to study it further." "And your own movements, Lady Eleanor? Were you in the conservatory at any point during the night of the theft?" "Good heavens, no. I retired to my chambers shortly after dinner and did not leave them until this morning. I heard nothing untoward." "Thank you, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, rising. "Your insights have been most helpful." As we left the drawing-room, I turned to Holmes. "She seems genuinely surprised by the suggestion of Thorne's involvement, and her denial of the legend's influence on her seemed rather unconvincing." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes murmured. "A woman of romantic temperament, as her brother described. Such individuals are often drawn to the allure of the esoteric. Now, I believe a thorough examination of the conservatory's exterior is in order." We returned to the vast glass house. The mist had begun to thin, revealing the manicured lawns and ancient trees surrounding the structure. Holmes circled the conservatory slowly, his eyes sweeping over every detail, his hands occasionally touching the glass, the stone foundation, the very earth itself. He paid particular attention to the roof, craning his neck to examine the intricate glass panels. He then walked to a small unassuming shed located some 50 yards from the conservatory, a structure that appeared to house gardening tools. "Mr. Finch," Holmes called out, "what is the purpose of this shed?" "That is Hemlock's potting shed, Mr. Holmes," Finch replied, joining us. "He keeps his tools and various horticultural supplies within." Holmes examined the shed's lock, a simple padlock, then pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fertilizer and damp earth. Shovels, rakes, and various gardening implements hung neatly on the walls. In one corner, a workbench was cluttered with terracotta pots, bags of soil, and a watering can. Holmes's eyes, however, were drawn to a coil of thin, strong rope hanging on a peg near the door. He took it down, testing its strength, his brow furrowed in thought. "This rope, Mr. Finch," he said, turning the coil over in his hands. "Is it regularly used?" "Not that I'm aware of, Mr. Holmes. Hemlock usually uses twine for his smaller tasks. That rope looks rather new, actually." Holmes nodded, then moved to the workbench. He picked up a small, almost imperceptible fragment of something dark and fibrous from the surface, examining it closely under his magnifying glass. "Interesting," he murmured, dropping the fragment into a small envelope he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "Very interesting indeed." He then returned to the conservatory, his gaze once again fixed on the roof. He walked along the side of the building, his eyes scanning the ground beneath the eaves. Suddenly he stopped. He bent down, his fingers brushing against a patch of damp earth. He then pointed to a faint, almost invisible indentation in the soil. "Watson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "observe this, a very subtle impression, and here another, and here." I knelt beside him. The indentations were indeed faint, but discernible. A series of shallow depressions, as if something heavy had been repeatedly placed and then lifted. They led from the direction of the potting shed along the side of the conservatory, and then seemed to stop directly beneath a large hinged skylight on the roof. "A ladder, Watson," Holmes explained, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "A ladder repeatedly placed against the side of the conservatory, directly beneath that skylight, and this rope, I suspect, was used to hoist something up to the roof." Finch, who had been observing with growing astonishment, now gasped, "But the skylight, Mr. Holmes, it is sealed. It has not been opened in years." "Indeed, Mr. Finch," Holmes said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But a seal, however robust, can be broken, and then, perhaps, resealed. Let us examine that skylight more closely." He instructed Finch to find a longer ladder, and within minutes we were ascending to the roof. The skylight in question was indeed large and heavy, its glass panels encrusted with years of grime. Holmes, however, ignored the dirt. He focused on the hinges, the locking mechanism, and the surrounding lead flashing. "Here, Watson," he said, pointing to a minute scratch on the lead. "A fresh mark. And here, a faint smudge of what appears to be grease. And observe the dust, Mr. Finch. The dust around the edges of the skylight is disturbed, as if something has recently been moved." Finch peered closely. "But it looks perfectly sealed, Mr. Holmes." "To the casual eye, perhaps," Holmes conceded, "but not to the eye trained to observe the minutiae. The thief, Mr. Finch, did not enter through the oak door. He entered through the roof. He lowered himself into the chamber, took the orchid, and then ascended, carefully resealing the skylight to conceal his method." "But how could he have known about the skylight?" Finch exclaimed. "And how could he have sealed it from the outside?" "Ah, those are excellent questions, Mr. Finch," Holmes said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Questions that lead us back to our limited circle of suspects. The individual who knew the layout of the conservatory intimately, who knew of the orchid's bloom, and who possessed the ingenuity to execute such a precise and audacious theft." "Professor Thorne," Finch whispered, his face paling. "A strong candidate, certainly," Holmes agreed. "He had access, he had knowledge, and he had a motive, a scientific fascination, perhaps, or a belief in the orchid's more esoteric properties, a belief he may have feigned to dismiss. But there is another possibility, Mr. Finch, one that is perhaps even more unsettling." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, creating a dramatic tension that was almost unbearable. "The thief, Mr. Finch," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone, "possessed not only knowledge of the conservatory's hidden weakness, but also a means to access it without arousing suspicion. a means that would allow them to move about the grounds and the house unseen, even in the dead of night. He turned to Finch, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Mr. Finch, does your sister, Lady Eleanor, possess a particular affinity for climbing? Or perhaps a secret passion for horticulture that extends beyond casual interest?" Finch stared at Holmes, his mouth agape, a look of profound shock spreading across his features. "Eleanor? My sister? Mr. Holmes, that is an outrageous accusation." "Is it, Mr. Finch?" Holmes countered, his voice calm but insistent. "Consider the facts. She knew of the orchid's bloom. She was fascinated by its legends. She was present in the house. And she possessed a motive, however irrational it may seem to us, the allure of a mystical power. Furthermore, the scent of the orchid, so strong in the house, suggests it was carried through the main living areas, not just directly out of the conservatory. And the resealing of the skylight from the outside requires a certain dexterity, a familiarity with the structure." But why?" Finch stammered, clearly struggling to comprehend the implication. "Why would Eleanor steal our own family heirloom?" "That, Mr. Finch, is the core of the mystery," Holmes said, descending the ladder. "The why is often more complex than the how, but I believe we have established the how. Now we must uncover the motive and the full extent of this peculiar intrigue." He paused, looking back at the imposing manor house, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "This case, Watson, has just become considerably more interesting." I knew then that the intellectual torpor had been thoroughly banished. The hunt was on, and the scent of the rubra mysterium, both literal and metaphorical, now led us down a path far more winding and perilous than any of us could have initially imagined. The shadow in the gaslight had deepened, and its true form remained tantalizingly out of reach. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Fletcher. Alistair Finch's face, already pale with anxiety, drained of all colour at Holmes's audacious suggestion. He stood frozen on the conservatory roof, the damp morning air seemingly unable to penetrate the sudden chill that had gripped him. "Eleanor?" he finally managed, his voice a strained whisper, as if the very utterance of her name in such a context were sacrilege. "My own sister? Mr. Holmes, you cannot be serious. It is unthinkable." Holmes, ever unperturbed by the emotional turmoil of his clients, merely descended the last rung of the ladder with a quiet grace. "Unthinkable, Mr. Finch, is a word often employed by those unwilling to face the uncomfortable truths that logic dictates. My deductions, while perhaps unpalatable, are based upon observable facts. The method of entry, the resealing of the skylight, the lingering scent of the orchid throughout the house, and Lady Eleanor's own admitted fascination with the rubra mysterium's legendary properties, these are not mere coincidences. They form a pattern, however distressing it may be to your sensibilities." I, too, felt a pang of discomfort. Lady Eleanor, with her quiet dignity and melancholic eyes, hardly seemed the type to engage in such a clandestine act. Yet Holmes's logic, however cold, was rarely flawed. "But the motive, Mr. Holmes," Finch protested, his voice rising in desperation. "Why would she? For a fanciful legend. Eleanor is a woman of means, of station. She has no need for such trickery." "The motives of the human heart, Mr. Finch, are rarely so straightforward as mere financial gain," Holmes replied, his gaze sweeping over the manor house with an almost surgical precision. "Indeed, they are often far more complex, driven by desires and beliefs that defy conventional understanding. The allure of power, however illusory, can be a potent narcotic. And if Lady Eleanor truly believes in the orchid's ability to grant singular clarity of mind or a glimpse into the future, then her motive, from her own perspective, would be profound." He then turned his attention to the fragment of fibre he had collected from Hemlock's potting shed. He held the small envelope up to the light, peering at the dark, almost silken strand within. "This, Mr. Finch, is another piece of our puzzle, a fibre quite distinct from any common twine or rope. I shall require a closer examination of it back in London, but its presence here, in a shed used for gardening, is suggestive." Finch, still reeling, could only nod mutely. He seemed trapped between his loyalty to his sister and the undeniable force of Holmes's reasoning. "Now, Mr. Finch," Holmes continued, his tone becoming more practical, "I believe a more thorough investigation of the interior of the house is warranted, specifically Lady Eleanor's private chambers, with your permission, of course." Finch hesitated, then, with a heavy sigh, conceded. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I suppose it is necessary, though I pray you are mistaken." Lady Eleanor, informed by Craggs of Holmes's request, received us with a composure that, to my eyes, seemed almost too perfect. There was a subtle tension around her mouth, a faint tremor in her hands as she gestured for us to enter her sitting room, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her gaze direct, "my brother informs me of your rather startling hypothesis. I confess I find it quite absurd." "Absurdity, Lady Eleanor, is often merely a perspective," Holmes countered, his eyes already scanning the room, taking in every detail with his usual rapid precision. "The facts, however, remain. The orchid vanished from a locked chamber, and the method of entry points to someone with intimate knowledge of the conservatory's structure and a certain physical capability." "And you believe that physical capability resides in me?" she asked, a faint, incredulous smile touching her lips. "Mr. Holmes, I assure you, my days of scaling walls are long past, if they ever existed." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his gaze settling on a small, exquisitely carved wooden box on a nearby table. "Yet the human body, when motivated by a sufficiently powerful desire, can achieve remarkable feats. Lady Eleanor, you admitted a fascination with the orchid's legends. Do you, in truth, dismiss them as mere old wives' tales?" Her eyes flickered, a fleeting shadow crossing them. "I find them intriguing, Mr. Holmes, as I said before, but to act upon them, to steal a family heirloom for such a fantastical notion, that is beyond the pale." "Beyond the pale for you, perhaps, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, his voice soft, almost conversational, yet imbued with an undeniable weight. "But not, perhaps, for someone whose belief in such powers runs deeper than mere intellectual curiosity. Tell me, Lady Eleanor, do you keep a diary?" The question was so abrupt, so seemingly unconnected to the topic at hand, that it visibly startled her. Her composure, so carefully maintained, faltered for a fraction of a second. "A diary? What a peculiar question, Mr. Holmes. I occasionally make notes, yes, of my botanical observations, mostly. And where might these notes be kept? In my private study, of course, across the hall." Her voice was a little sharper now, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. "Might we examine them?" "Mr. Holmes, this is an intrusion. My private papers are not relevant to this unfortunate incident." "On the contrary, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, rising from his seat, "in a case such as this, where the conventional explanations fail, every detail, every personal inclination becomes relevant. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear from a brief perusal of your notes." Her eyes met his, a silent battle of wills playing out between them. Finally, with a weary sigh, she relented. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, but I warn you, you will find nothing but dry botanical observations." She led us across the hall to a smaller room, lined with bookshelves filled with volumes on horticulture and natural history. A large, mahogany desk dominated the centre, cluttered with papers, magnifying glasses, and a collection of dried flowers. Holmes went directly to the desk, his eyes scanning the various notebooks and folios. He picked up a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant script. "These are indeed botanical observations, Watson," he murmured, flipping through the pages. "Detailed notes on various species, their growth patterns, their requirements. But here—" He stopped at a page near the back, his finger tracing a passage. It was a passage written in a different hand, a more hurried, almost feverish script, interspersed with sketches of the rubra mysterium in various stages of bloom. The words were not strictly botanical. They spoke of the awakening, of the veil thinning, and of the glimpse beyond. "The crimson eye opens to the future's whisper," Holmes read aloud, his voice devoid of inflection. "The mind, unburdened, sees the path. The power once tasted cannot be denied." He looked up, his gaze fixed on Lady Eleanor, who stood rigid by the doorway, her face pale. "This, Lady Eleanor, is hardly a dry botanical observation. This reads like the fervent belief of a devotee." Lady Eleanor wrung her hands. It is merely a fanciful entry, Mr. Holmes, a moment of poetic indulgence. I assure you, I do not truly believe in such magical properties." "Do you not?" Holmes pressed. "Then why the detailed sketches of the orchid at its peak? Why the personal reflections on its power? And why, Lady Eleanor, did you not mention these more esoteric interests to your brother or to us when first questioned?" She remained silent, her eyes cast down. The carefully constructed facade of composure had finally cracked. "And this," Holmes continued, turning his attention to the small, exquisitely carved wooden box he had noticed earlier in her sitting room. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small, intricately designed silver key. It was unlike any ordinary key. Its teeth were delicate, almost artistic in their complexity. "This key, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, holding it up. "What does it unlock?" She flinched, her eyes widening. That is a personal item, Mr. Holmes. It has nothing to do with this matter." "On the contrary," Holmes said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "With this matter. This key, Lady Eleanor, is designed to open a very specific type of lock, one found perhaps on a certain private cabinet, or, dare I suggest, a certain skylight mechanism." Lady Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The skylight on the conservatory roof, Lady Eleanor," Holmes explained, his voice calm. "It is secured by a unique locking mechanism, one that would require a key of this precise design to open and, more importantly, to reseal from the outside. A key, I might add, that would not be in the possession of your head gardener Hemlock, who uses a simpler, more robust key for the oak door." He then produced the small envelope containing the dark, fibrous fragment. "And this, Lady Eleanor, was found in Hemlock's potting shed, near a coil of new rope, a fragment of silk, I believe. A very fine dark silk, perhaps from a scarf or a dressing gown worn during a nocturnal expedition." Lady Eleanor's face was now ashen. She swayed slightly, and I stepped forward, fearing she might faint. "No, Dr. Watson," she whispered, waving me away. I am quite well. Mr. Holmes, this is a monstrous accusation." "Is it an accusation, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said softly, "or merely the logical conclusion drawn from the evidence? The disturbed dust on the skylight, the faint impressions in the soil leading from the potting shed, the new rope, the silk fragment, your personal notes on the orchid's power, and now this key. All point to one undeniable truth. You, Lady Eleanor, entered the conservatory through the roof, stole the rubra mysterium, and then carefully concealed your tracks." She sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping, her regal bearing utterly gone. I did not intend. It was not a theft, Mr. Holmes. It was a necessity." "A necessity," Holmes prompted, his voice unwavering. She looked up, her eyes filled with a desperate, almost feverish light. "Yes, a necessity. The orchid, it was speaking to me, Mr. Holmes. In my dreams, it told me of a great peril, a shadow that was descending upon our family, upon Fletcher itself. It told me that only by consuming its essence at the peak of its bloom could I gain the clarity, the foresight, to avert the disaster." Finch, who had stood silently throughout this exchange, now stepped forward, his face a mask of horror. "Eleanor, what are you saying? You truly believe this madness?" "It is not madness, Alistair," she cried, her voice rising. "The legend is true. I felt its power. I saw glimpses, a crumbling tower, a serpentine shadow, a whisper of betrayal from within." Holmes held up a hand, silencing both of them. "Lady Eleanor, while your conviction is clear, the practicalities of the situation remain. You admit to taking the orchid. Where is it now?" She hesitated, then pointed to a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the study. "It is there. I consumed a small portion of its petals, just enough to gain the insight. The rest I preserved. I was going to return it once the peril had passed." Holmes walked to the cabinet and with a swift movement used the silver key to unlock it. Inside, nestled on a bed of damp moss, was the terracotta pot. But the orchid itself, the magnificent Orchidaceae rubra mysterium, was a withered, pathetic shadow of its former glory. Its crimson petals were shriveled, its stem limp. It was dying. "Good heavens!" Finch exclaimed, rushing forward. "Eleanor, what have you done? You've destroyed it!" No, I haven't. And Lady Eleanor cried, tears streaming down her face. "It was only a small portion. It should regenerate. It must." Holmes examined the dying plant with a detached, clinical eye. "Lady Eleanor, the rubra mysterium, like all living things, is finite. Its unique properties, if they exist, are tied to its vitality. By consuming its petals, you have not merely taken a portion. You have, I fear, inflicted a mortal wound upon it. It will not regenerate." A profound despair settled upon Lady Eleanor. She sank back into her chair, her earlier fervour replaced by a crushing realization. "So," I said, looking at the withered orchid, "the theft was not for profit, nor for malice, but for a delusion." "A delusion, Watson, born of a desperate hope." Holmes corrected me, his voice tinged with a rare note of something akin to pity. Lady Eleanor, your belief in the orchid's power, however misguided, led you to a desperate act. But the peril you sensed, the crumbling tower and serpentine shadow, what precisely did you perceive? She shuddered. It was fragmented, Mr. Holmes, like a dream just beyond recall. But the betrayal, it was a whisper, a feeling of deep-seated treachery from someone close, someone within these very walls. Holmes's eyes narrowed. From within, not Professor Thorne, then? You spoke of him with respect. Thorne, no, she murmured, shaking her head. The feeling was different, more intimate, a betrayal of trust, not merely a scientific rivalry. Interesting, Holmes said, placing the dying orchid back into the cabinet and locking it. So the rubra mysterium has been sacrificed, and yet the perceived peril remains, and the circle of suspicion, far from narrowing, has merely shifted. If not Professor Thorne, and if not a simple theft, then who else within this house might harbour such treacherous intent? He turned to Alistair Finch. Mr. Finch, your butler Craggs, how long has he been in your employ? Finch, still visibly shaken by his sister's confession, replied, Craggs? Why, he's been with the family for nearly 30 years, Mr. Holmes, utterly dependable, beyond reproach. Indeed, Holmes murmured, a thoughtful frown on his face. And what of his background, his family, his personal life? I know little of it, to be honest, Finch admitted. He is a very private man, always has been, efficient, discreet, that is all one requires of a butler. Perhaps, Holmes said, his gaze distant, but discretion, Mr. Finch, can sometimes be a cloak for deeper secrets, and efficiency a mask for ambition. I recall his demeanour upon our arrival last night, a sternness that bordered on disapproval, and a certain lack of surprise at the late hour. I found myself recalling Craggs' flat voice, his unblinking gaze. He had indeed seemed rather detached from the unfolding drama. And old man Hemlock, Holmes continued, you described him as utterly devoted. Yet he is the sole possessor of the key to the conservatory door. A chain around his neck, you said. Did you ever observe him remove it? Never, Mr. Holmes, Finch replied. He is meticulous about it. It is almost a part of him. And the new rope in his potting shed, Holmes mused. He claimed not to use it, yet it was there, and the silk fragment. These are details that do not quite align with the portrait of utter trustworthiness you paint, Mr. Finch. Are you suggesting Hemlock? Finch looked aghast. But why? He loves that orchid. He's cared for it since he was a boy. Love, Mr. Finch, can be a powerful motivator, Holmes said cryptically, and devotion, when misplaced, can lead to unexpected ends. We must consider all avenues. The betrayal from within, Lady Eleanor perceived, however vaguely, cannot be dismissed out of hand. He then walked to the window, gazing out at the still misty grounds. Watson, I believe it is time for us to explore the hidden corners of Fletcher Manor, the servants' quarters, the cellars, perhaps even the archives. The truth, I suspect, lies buried not in grand revelations, but in the forgotten details, the overlooked connections. Our investigation of the manor's less frequented areas proved to be a tedious, yet ultimately rewarding endeavour. The servants' quarters, a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small Spartan rooms, offered little in the way of immediate clues. The staff, though polite, were guarded, their answers brief and unrevealing. Craggs, the butler, remained impassive, answering Holmes's pointed questions with a quiet deference that bordered on evasiveness. He claimed to have heard nothing unusual the night of the theft, attributing the silence to the thick mist. A convenient explanation, Watson, Holmes murmured to me as we left the butler's cramped room. Too convenient, perhaps. A man of his years, accustomed to the nocturnal rhythms of a large house, would surely detect even the faintest disturbance, mist or no mist. The cellars beneath the manor were a damp, cavernous expanse, filled with dusty wine racks and forgotten relics. Here, amidst the cobwebs and the musty air, Holmes found something. Tucked away behind a stack of ancient crates, almost entirely obscured by shadow, was a small wooden box. It was unadorned, save for a single tarnished brass plate on its lid. With a grunt of effort, Holmes pulled it into the meagre light filtering from a distant window. The box was surprisingly heavy. He tried the lid, but it was locked. A curious find, Watson, Holmes observed, turning the box over in his hands. No keyhole, however, a puzzle box perhaps, or a secret compartment. He ran his fingers along the seams, pressing, prodding, his keen eyes searching for any hidden mechanism. Finally, with a faint click, a small panel on the side slid open, revealing a tiny, almost invisible keyhole. "Ah, a cunning device," Holmes said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "But the key, where might it be?" We searched the immediate vicinity, but found nothing. Holmes then produced his trusty set of picks, and with a few deft manipulations, the lock yielded. Inside the box, nestled amongst layers of yellowed tissue paper, were several items. A small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, a tarnished silver locket, and a dried, pressed flower, a faded, almost colourless orchid, clearly a much older specimen of the rubra mysterium. Holmes picked up the journal. Its cover bore no name, no title. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling softly. The script within was faded but legible. It was a diary, written in a hand that was distinctly feminine and dated from nearly a century ago. As Holmes read, his expression grew increasingly grim. The entries spoke of a young woman, Lady Seraphina Finch, an ancestor of Alastair and Eleanor, who had been obsessed with the rubra mysterium. She believed it held the key to unlocking hidden knowledge, to communing with the spirits of the past. Her entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with wild prophecies and paranoid delusions. She spoke of a serpentine shadow that sought to corrupt the family line, of a betrayal from within that would lead to ruin. One entry, dated precisely a century ago, described her consuming the orchid's petals, convinced it would grant her ultimate foresight. The subsequent entries were a descent into madness, incoherent ramblings about visions and voices, culminating in a final, desperate plea for salvation from the shadow. "Good heavens, Holmes," I murmured, a chill running down my spine. "This is chilling. Lady Eleanor's visions, her serpentine shadow and betrayal from within, they are almost identical to her ancestors' delusions." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes said, his voice grave. "A hereditary delusion, perhaps, or a shared susceptibility to the orchid's purported influence. It seems the legend of the rubra mysterium has a far more sinister history than Mr. Finch realized. This plant, it seems, does not grant clarity of mind, but rather a profound and dangerous madness." He then picked up the silver locket. It was tarnished, but its intricate engraving was still discernible, a serpent entwined around a blooming orchid. He opened it. Inside, on one side, was a faded miniature portrait of a young woman with wild, haunted eyes, unmistakably Lady Seraphina. On the other side, a lock of dark, silken hair. "The silk fragment, Watson," Holmes said, holding up the locket. "The one I found in Hemlock's shed. It is identical to this hair. Dark, fine, almost black. This suggests a connection, a continuity between the past and the present." "But how does this connect to Hemlock?" I asked, perplexed. "And why would this box be hidden in the cellar?" "Ah, those are the questions that now occupy my thoughts, Watson," Holmes replied, carefully placing the items back into the box. "This diary suggests that the orchid, far from being a benevolent source of insight, is a catalyst for madness. Lady Eleanor has fallen prey to the same delusion as her ancestor, but the presence of this box hidden away and the silk fragment in Hemlock's shed, these are not easily explained by Lady Eleanor's actions alone." He locked the box and placed it back in its hiding place. "Someone else, Watson, knows of this history. Someone who has deliberately concealed it. And someone, perhaps, who has been manipulating Lady Eleanor's fragile state of mind." "You suspect Hemlock, then?" "He is certainly a person of interest. His devotion to the family, his meticulous nature, his sole possession of the key to the conservatory door, all could be interpreted in a new, more sinister light. And the new rope in his shed, which he claimed not to use, yet was clearly employed to access the skylight. It is a curious inconsistency." We emerged from the cellars into the fading afternoon light. The mist had finally lifted, revealing the full grandeur and perhaps the full melancholy of Fletcher Manor. "Watson," Holmes said, as we walked towards the main house, "I believe it is time for us to pay another visit to Professor Alaric Thorne. His initial interest in the orchid, his astronomical offer, and his seemingly innocuous departure now take on a new significance in light of Lady Seraphina's diary. Did he know of the orchid's darker history? Was he merely a curious botanist, or something more?" He paused at the threshold of the manor, his gaze sweeping over the ancient stone. "This house, Watson, is not merely a collection of bricks and mortar. It is a repository of secrets, of old sorrows, and perhaps of a madness that has festered for generations. The theft of the rubra mysterium is but the opening act of a far more profound and disturbing drama. I felt a shiver run down my spine despite the relative warmth of the afternoon. The case, which had begun as a peculiar theft, was rapidly transforming into something far more intricate, a tapestry woven with threads of ancient legend, hereditary madness, and a pervasive sense of betrayal. The shadow in the gaslight was growing longer, and its true source remained elusive, lurking in the depths of Fletcher's shadowed past. Chapter 3. The Botanist's Lair. The journey from Fletcher Manor to the London residence of Professor Alaric Thorne was a swift, if somewhat sombre, affair. The revelations concerning Lady Eleanor's desperate act, coupled with the chilling discovery of Lady Seraphina's diary, had cast a long, unsettling shadow over our investigation. The rubra mysterium, once a symbol of beauty and rarity, now seemed a cursed object, a catalyst for madness that had haunted the Finch family for generations. Holmes, though outwardly composed, exhibited that subtle tension in his jaw, that almost imperceptible tightening of his lips, which always betrayed the furious workings of his mind. He spoke little during the train ride, his gaze fixed on the fleeting landscape, no doubt piecing together the fragmented narrative of hereditary delusion and hidden secrets. "Watson," he finally pronounced, as the grimy rooftops of London began to loom into view. The human mind, when confronted with the inexplicable, often seeks solace in the supernatural. Lady Eleanor's conviction, however fervent, stems from a deeply ingrained family myth, one that has been tragically reinforced by her ancestors' own descent into madness. Our task now is to ascertain who, if anyone, has exploited this susceptibility. Was Professor Thorne merely a curious botanist, or a more sinister architect of this peculiar drama? I considered this. It seems a stretch, Holmes. A man of science manipulating a fragile mind for a withered flower? The value of an object, my dear Watson, is often in the eye of the beholder. To Lady Eleanor, the orchid promised foresight. To a botanist like Thorne, it might represent a unique specimen, a scientific triumph, or perhaps a key to unlocking some hitherto unknown property. And let us not forget his astronomical offer for its acquisition. Men of science, like all men, are susceptible to avarice, or indeed to obsession. Professor Thorne's residence was located in a quiet, respectable square in Bloomsbury, a district known for its scholarly inhabitants and its proximity to the British Museum. The house itself was a rather austere Victorian townhouse, its brickwork darkened by years of London soot, but its windows gleamed, and a faint, earthy scent, surprisingly pleasant, wafted from within. We were admitted by a young, rather nervous maid who seemed overwhelmed by the very presence of two gentlemen, one of whom possessed such an unnerving intensity of gaze. "Professor Thorne is in his laboratory, sirs," she stammered, leading us through a dimly lit hallway. The laboratory was, in truth, a vast, glass-roofed conservatory grafted onto the rear of the house, far grander and more extensive than any private collection I had ever witnessed. It was a verdant jungle under glass, filled with an astonishing array of exotic plants, their leaves dripping with condensation, their blossoms emitting a heady, humid perfume. The air was thick and warm, a stark contrast to the damp London autumn outside. Professor Alaric Thorne himself was a man who seemed almost to have grown from the very soil he cultivated. He was tall and gaunt, with a shock of unruly grey hair and spectacles perched precariously on his aquiline nose. His hands, though slender, were stained with earth, and his tweed jacket was liberally smudged with green. He was bent over a workbench, meticulously examining a specimen under a powerful magnifying lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as we entered, his eyes, magnified by his spectacles, blinking in surprise. "Mr. Holmes, and Dr. Watson, I presume? This is an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the honour of this visit?" His voice was a low, resonant rumble like distant thunder. "Professor Thorne," Holmes began, his voice calm and measured, "we are here concerning the recent disappearance of the Orchidaceae rubra mysterium from Fletcher Manor." Thorne's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable. Surprise, concern, crossing his features. "Ah, yes. A most regrettable incident. Mr. Finch informed me by telegram this morning. A tragedy, truly. That magnificent specimen gone. Have you made any progress in its recovery?" Indeed, Professor, Holmes replied, his gaze sweeping over the array of exotic plants, lingering for a moment on a particularly vibrant, almost unnaturally red bloom. We have. In fact, we have recovered the orchid, or what remains of it. Thorne's eyes widened, and he straightened up, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. Recovered? But how? And what do you mean, what remains of it? Holmes then recounted with a concise precision that omitted only the most intimate details of Lady Eleanor's delusion, the manner in which the orchid had been taken and its subsequent state. He described the skylight entry, the silver key, and the withered plant. He did not, however, reveal Lady Seraphina's diary or the hereditary madness. Thorne listened intently, his expression a mixture of scientific curiosity and genuine dismay. When Holmes finished, the botanist sighed deeply. Good heavens, so Lady Eleanor herself, driven by such a belief. A tragic outcome for such a magnificent plant. I had hoped to study it further, to unlock its secrets through purely scientific means, its unique cellular structure, its extraordinary pigmentation. A lifetime's work, perhaps. You expressed a keen interest in its properties, Professor, Holmes observed, his eyes fixed on Thorne, and made a rather substantial offer for its acquisition. Thorne nodded. Indeed, the rubra mysterium is, as you know, unique. Its genetic makeup, its resilience, its unprecedented coloration, it represents a pinnacle of botanical evolution. My offer, while considerable, reflected its unparalleled scientific value. I wished to cultivate it, to propagate it, to ensure its survival for future generations of botanists. And its legendary properties, Professor? Holmes pressed. The whispers of clarity of mind and glimpses into the future? Did these hold any sway over your scientific curiosity? Thorne chuckled, a dry academic sound. Mr. Holmes, as a man of science, I deal in empirical evidence, not fanciful folklore. While I am aware of the various myths surrounding such rare specimens, the mandrake's scream, the lotus's forgetfulness, I view them merely as cultural curiosities. My interest in the rubra mysterium was purely academic. Its alleged mystical powers were, to me, merely an interesting historical footnote. His denial was firm, almost dismissive, yet I detected a subtle tension in his posture, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. It was a fleeting impression, perhaps, but one that Holmes, I knew, would not have missed. You spent several days at Fletcher Manor, Professor, Holmes continued, examining the orchid, making sketches, taking notes. Did you at any point observe any unusual behaviour from Lady Eleanor? Any signs of her growing obsession with the plant's legends? Thorne paused, stroking his beard. Lady Eleanor is a sensitive soul, Mr. Holmes. And yes, she did speak of the family legends. She seemed rather enamoured with them, I confess. I merely indulged her as one does with a gracious hostess. I certainly had no inkling that her fascination would lead to such a drastic act. And the security of the conservatory, Professor? Holmes asked, his voice casual. Did you discuss its vulnerabilities with anyone? Vulnerabilities? Thorne raised an eyebrow. No, Mr. Holmes. I merely noted its robust construction. A fine example of Victorian engineering, I thought. I assumed it was quite impregnable. Yet it was penetrated, Professor, Holmes stated, his gaze unwavering, through a skylight which was then resealed from the outside, a method that would require intimate knowledge of the structure and a certain ingenuity. Thorne's eyes widened behind his spectacles. Through the skylight? Remarkable, I confess, that had not occurred to me. A most audacious feat indeed. But how could Lady Eleanor? He trailed off, shaking his head. The silver key, Professor, Holmes interjected, producing a small sketch he had made of the intricate key Lady Eleanor possessed. Have you ever seen a key of this design before? Or a lock that it might open? Thorne took the sketch, his brow furrowed in concentration. He examined it closely, turning it this way and that. Unusual, very unusual. The teeth are quite delicate. Custom-made, I should think. I cannot say I have encountered such a design in my travels, Mr. Holmes. It appears to be a bespoke mechanism. His denial seemed genuine. Yet Holmes's eyes, I observed, were still fixed on the botanist, searching for the slightest tell, the merest flicker of deceit. Professor Thorne, Holmes said, changing tack, do you possess any other specimens of the rubra mysterium? Perhaps a smaller, less developed plant? Or a seed? Thorne shook his head emphatically. Alas, no. The rubra mysterium is, as I stated, unique. It has never been successfully propagated from seed or cutting. Its very existence is a botanical enigma. That is why its loss is so profound from a scientific perspective." "And the silk fragment, Professor?" Holmes asked, producing the small envelope. "This was found in Hemlock's potting shed. It is a very fine, dark silk. Does it resemble any fabric you might possess?" Thorne took the envelope, his fingers carefully extracting the tiny fibre. He held it up to the light, then brought it close to his eyes. "Silk, yes, and a very high quality by the feel of it. But no, Mr. Holmes, I do not believe I own anything of this particular weave or colour. My wardrobe is rather utilitarian, as you can see." He gestured to his tweed jacket. He handed the fragment back. His movements were precise, his gaze steady. There was nothing in his immediate reaction that suggested deception. Holmes then turned his attention to Thorne's extensive collection of plants. He walked slowly through the conservatory, his eyes darting from one specimen to another, occasionally pausing to examine a leaf or a stem. He seemed to be searching for something specific, something that only his trained eye could discern. He stopped before a large potted plant with broad dark green leaves and a single unopened bud. He knelt, examining the soil, then the stem, and finally the bud itself. "This plant, Professor," Holmes said, his voice quiet. "What is its species?" Thorne joined him. "Ah, that is a rather rare specimen, Mr. Holmes, a Nocturna floris, a night-blooming orchid from the Amazon. Its petals unfurl only under the cover of darkness, and its fragrance, though subtle, is quite intoxicating." Holmes nodded then, to my surprise. He reached out and gently plucked a single, almost invisible hair from the surface of one of the broad leaves. He held it up to the light. It was a fine, almost translucent strand, much lighter in colour than the silk fragment. "A curious detail, Watson," Holmes murmured, placing the hair in a fresh envelope. "A single hair, of a colour and texture quite distinct from Professor Thorne's own, and on a plant that blooms only at night." He then straightened up, his gaze sweeping over Thorne's face with a renewed intensity. "Professor Thorne, you mentioned that the rubra mysterium has never been successfully propagated, yet its existence, its very survival, implies a certain resilience. Have you ever considered the possibility of a symbiotic relationship? A host plant, perhaps, that allows the rubra mysterium to thrive, even to regenerate?" Thorne blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in topic. "A symbiotic relationship? It is a fascinating concept, Mr. Holmes, but one for which there is no scientific evidence in the case of the rubra mysterium. Its unique properties are believed to be inherent to the plant itself, not dependent on a host." "Yet the natural world, Professor, is full of surprises," Holmes countered, "and the rubra mysterium, as you yourself admit, is an enigma. Consider this. If the orchid were to wither, to die as it has now, might there be a means to revive it? To draw its essence from a hidden source?" Thorne frowned, his gaze thoughtful. "Theoretically, perhaps. If its genetic material could be preserved, if its life force could be transferred. But these are the realms of botanical fantasy, Mr. Holmes, not practical science." "Indeed," Holmes said, a faint smile touching his lips. "But sometimes, Professor, fantasy and reality are more closely intertwined than we imagine. Thank you for your time, Professor Thorne. You have been most illuminating." As we left Thorne's conservatory, stepping back into the cool London air, I turned to Holmes. "Well, Holmes, what did you make of him?" He seemed genuinely surprised by the method of entry, and his denials regarding the legends and the silk fragment seemed convincing enough. "Convincing, perhaps, to the casual observer, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with a renewed intensity, "but not to one who observes the subtle nuances, the almost imperceptible tells. His initial surprise at the skylight entry was perhaps a shade too pronounced, and his dismissal of the legends, while logical for a man of science, lacked a certain conviction. Furthermore, the hair I found on the Nocturna floris is not his. It is a very fine, light-coloured hair, a woman's hair, perhaps, and on a plant that blooms only at night, suggesting a nocturnal visitor." "A nocturnal visitor," I repeated, my mind racing. "But who, and why?" "Ah, those are the questions. Watson," Holmes said, hailing a passing hansom cab. "Questions that lead us back to Fletcher Manor. For I believe, my dear fellow, that Professor Thorne, far from being merely a curious botanist, is indeed connected to this affair in a far more intricate manner than he would have us believe. And the serpentine shadow Lady Eleanor perceived, the betrayal from within, I suspect its true form is far more tangible and far more dangerous than a mere delusion. The cab rattled through the bustling streets of London, carrying us back towards Baker Street. Holmes, now fully immersed in the chase, produced his magnifying glass and began to examine the single fine hair he had collected from Thorne's conservatory. "This hair, Watson," he mused, holding it up to the light, "is not merely a detail. It is a thread connecting our seemingly disparate clues. The silk fragment from Hemlock's shed, the silver key from Lady Eleanor's study, the dying orchid, the ancient diary, and now this hair from Professor Thorne's nocturnal bloom. They are all pieces of a larger, more sinister tapestry." "But what do they signify?" I asked, my mind still grappling with the complexities of the case. "The silk and the hair, are they from the same person? And if so, who?" "That, my dear Watson, is what we must now ascertain," Holmes replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The silk suggests a connection to Hemlock, or at least to his shed. The hair suggests a connection to Thorne and a nocturnal presence in his conservatory. If these two seemingly disparate threads belong to the same individual, then we have a third party, a hidden hand, manipulating events from the shadows. And that, Watson, would be a development of the utmost gravity." He leaned back in the cab, his eyes closed, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin. I knew then that his mind was working at a furious pace, sifting through the evidence, discarding the irrelevant, and forging new connections. The case, far from being concluded with Lady Eleanor's confession, had merely deepened, revealing layers of deceit and a hidden antagonist whose motives remained shrouded in mystery. The shadow in the gaslight was no longer a mere figment of imagination. It was a tangible presence, lurking in the labyrinthine corridors of Fletcher Manor, and its influence, I feared, extended far beyond the confines of that ancient house. The game, as Holmes would say, was most certainly afoot, and the stakes, I sensed, were growing higher with every passing hour. Chapter 4: The Serpent's Coil. The hansom cab rattled through the bustling thoroughfares of London, the cacophony of the city a stark contrast to the quiet contemplation that during these periods of intense cerebration. His mind, I was certain, was weaving a tapestry of logic from the disparate threads we had gathered. Upon our return to our familiar rooms at 221B, Holmes immediately retired to his chemical laboratory, a small, cluttered sanctum where he performed his more arcane analyses. I heard the faint clinking of glassware, the soft hiss of a Bunsen burner, and the occasional, almost inaudible murmur as he worked. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were these and the persistent scratching of my pen as I attempted to transcribe the day's events into my journal, my thoughts still reeling from the implications of Lady Seraphina's diary and Lady Eleanor's desperate confession. Finally, Holmes emerged, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, almost feverish intensity that always signalled a significant breakthrough. He held a pair of forceps, at the end of which was clutched the single, light-coloured hair. In his other hand he held a microscope slide upon which lay the dark silk fragment. "Watson," he announced, his voice low and resonant, "the threads, my dear fellow, are beginning to intertwine with a most alarming precision. Observe." He gestured for me to join him at the small table near the window, where the afternoon light, now struggling to penetrate the perpetual London gloom, still offered some illumination. "The silk fragment," he began, pointing to the slide, "is indeed a remarkable specimen. Under the microscope, its fibres reveal a unique weave, a pattern that is not merely rare, but almost archaic. It is a type of silk, Watson, known as serpentine weave, so named for the subtle, undulating pattern within its threads, reminiscent of a coiled serpent. This particular weave was highly fashionable amongst certain esoteric circles in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, particularly those with an interest in ancient mysticism and symbolism. Its dark, almost obsidian hue, combined with this distinctive pattern, suggests a garment of ceremonial significance rather than everyday wear." I peered into the eyepiece. The pattern was indeed subtle, yet unmistakable once pointed out, a faint, almost shimmering undulation that gave the fabric an uncanny living quality. "Remarkable, Holmes. But how does this connect to Lady Seraphina's hair?" "Ah, the very crux of the matter," Holmes said, a faint smile playing on his lips. The lock of hair found in Lady Seraphina's locket, which I have also examined under the microscope, possesses a similar, albeit natural, undulation. It is a genetic trait, Watson, a subtle wave in the very structure of the hair follicle, and its colour, while faded by time, was undoubtedly a deep, rich black, identical to the silk. This suggests a profound connection between Lady Seraphina and this serpentine weave. Perhaps she wore such a garment, or perhaps it was a symbol of her devotion to the orchid's purported powers. He then carefully transferred the light-coloured hair from the forceps to a separate slide. Now for our second thread. This hair found on Professor Thorne's Nocturna Floris. It is, as I suspected, a woman's hair. Fine, almost ethereal in its lightness and possessing a natural, almost silvery sheen, quite distinct from Lady Seraphina's dark locks. This suggests a different individual entirely, but its presence on a night-blooming orchid in a private conservatory points to a clandestine visit, a nocturnal assignation. So, 2 different women then, I mused. One connected to the past, the other to the present and to Professor Thorne. Precisely, Watson, Holmes affirmed, leaning back. But the plot thickens. My analysis of the soil particles adhering to this light hair reveals microscopic traces of volcanic ash, a specific type found only in a remote region of the Amazon basin, a region known for its rare and exotic flora, including, I might add, the Nocturna Floris itself. This suggests that our nocturnal visitor to Professor Thorne's conservatory has recently travelled from, or has a strong connection to, that very specific part of the world. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Now, consider this. Professor Thorne, a renowned botanist specializing in exotic flora, expresses an astronomical interest in the rubra mysterium. He visits Fletcher Manor, where he converses at length with Lady Eleanor, a woman already susceptible to the orchid's legends. He then returns to his London conservatory, where a woman with a connection to the Amazon and to rare night-blooming orchids makes a clandestine visit. And Lady Eleanor's visions, I interjected, her serpentine shadow and betrayal from within, they echo Lady Seraphina's delusions. Indeed, Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. And the serpentine weave silk found in Hemlock's shed, a place where it has no logical business being and identical in colour and texture to Lady Seraphina's hair. This is not mere coincidence, Watson. This is a deliberate design, a carefully orchestrated manipulation. He rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. My theory, Watson, is this. The serpentine shadow Lady Seraphina perceived, and which Lady Eleanor now echoes, is not a mere delusion. It is a tangible entity. A secret society, perhaps, or a clandestine order, dedicated to the study, and perhaps the exploitation, of the rubra mysterium's unique properties. A society that has been observing the Finch family for generations, waiting for the opportune moment to intervene. A secret society? I exclaimed, startled. Good heavens, Holmes, that sounds like something from a penny dreadful. The most dangerous truths, Watson, often masquerade as the most improbable fictions, Holmes countered, his gaze piercing. Consider the evidence. The unique properties of the orchid, its rarity, its historical connection to madness within the Finch family. Professor Thorne's unscientific interest in its legends, despite his denials. The clandestine visitor to his conservatory, and now the serpentine weave silk, a relic of a bygone era, yet appearing in a place designed to implicate Hemlock. So you believe Professor Thorne is a part of this society? I have little doubt of it. His feigned surprise at the skylight entry, his subtle tension when discussing the legends, these were the tells of a man concealing more than he revealed. He is not merely a botanist, he is an agent. And the woman with the light hair, the one with the Amazonian connection, is his accomplice. I believe her name is Miss Isolde Vane. Isolde Vane? I repeated, the name unfamiliar. A brilliant, albeit reclusive botanist in her own right, Holmes explained. Known for her daring expeditions into unexplored regions of the Amazon, she has published several obscure papers on rare and medicinal plants. Her expertise would be invaluable to such a society, and her light hair, Watson, would be a striking contrast to the darker hues of the Finch family, making her presence at Thorne's conservatory all the more noticeable to my trained eye. But why frame Hemlock with the silk fragment? A clever misdirection, Watson. The silk, Being so old and connected to Lady Seraphina would immediately draw suspicion towards the family's past, and perhaps towards Hemlock, who has served them for so long. It creates a false trail, leading us away from the true perpetrators. It suggests a long-standing internal conspiracy, rather than an external, organised one. So, the betrayal from within Lady Eleanor sensed was not from her brother, but from this society, working from within the Manor's sphere of influence. Precisely. The society has, I believe, cultivated a presence within Fletcher Manor, perhaps through subtle manipulation, or even through the recruitment of, while rooted in her hereditary susceptibility, may have been subtly influenced, perhaps even amplified, by agents of this society, guiding her towards the desperate act of consuming the orchid's petals. They wanted the orchid, Watson, but they wanted it in a specific state, consumed, its essence released, as per their own twisted interpretation of the legend. But why? If they wanted the orchid, why not simply steal it outright, rather than orchestrate such a convoluted scheme? Because, my dear Watson, they do not merely seek the plant itself, they seek its power, and their belief, however deluded, dictates that this power is unlocked through its consumption, through the awakening that Lady Seraphina described. They needed Lady Eleanor to perform the act, to be the conduit. They wanted the rubra mysterium to be activated, not merely possessed. A chill ran down my spine. The sheer audacity of such a scheme, the cold, calculated manipulation of a vulnerable mind, was truly horrifying. "And what of Craggs, the butler?" I asked. "And Hemlock? Are they involved?" Craggs, I suspect, is merely a loyal if somewhat obtuse servant, perhaps too set in his ways to notice the subtle machinations around him, or perhaps he is a low-level informant, unaware of the full scope of the society's intentions. Hemlock, however, is more intriguing. His devotion, his meticulous nature, his possession of the key, these could make him a valuable, if unwitting, asset to the society. The silk fragment in his shed suggests either that he was framed, or that he was somehow involved in its placement, perhaps under duress or deception. Holmes walked to the mantelpiece and picked up his pipe, slowly filling it with tobacco. "The Society of the Crimson Serpent, Watson. I believe that is what we are dealing with. An ancient order, perhaps, with roots stretching back centuries, dedicated to the pursuit of esoteric knowledge, and now focused on the rubra mysterium as their ultimate prize. They are cunning, patient, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit of what they believe to be power. So, what is our next move, Holmes?" "We return to Fletcher Manor, Watson," Holmes said, lighting his pipe, a plume of acrid smoke curling towards the ceiling. "But this time we do not go as mere investigators of a theft. We go as hunters. For I believe the true serpentine shadow still lurks within those ancient walls, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. They have sacrificed the orchid, but their ultimate goal, the peril Lady Eleanor sensed, remains. They may seek to exploit the Finch family further, perhaps even to eliminate them, to secure their control over Fletcher and its secrets." He paused, his gaze fixed on the swirling smoke. "I suspect, Watson, that the society has a hidden base, a secret chamber, perhaps even a network of tunnels beneath Fletcher Manor itself, a place from which they have observed and manipulated the family for generations. And I believe our Miss Isolde Vane, the woman with the light hair and the Amazonian connection, is likely to be found there, or will soon return. She is the link between Thorne's scientific ambition and the society's mystical designs." "But how will we find it?" I asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. The idea of a secret society operating beneath an ancient manor was far more unsettling than any common criminal enterprise. "We shall observe, Watson," Holmes replied, a grim smile on his face. "We shall watch, we shall listen, and we shall set a trap. For I believe that the Society of the Crimson Serpent, having achieved their immediate objective with the orchid, will now make their next move, and when they do, we shall be waiting." The gaslight in our sitting room flickered, casting long, dancing shadows upon the walls. The air, thick with the scent of tobacco and the lingering aroma of Holmes's chemical experiments, seemed to hum with an unspoken tension. The game was no longer merely afoot. It was poised on the precipice of a dangerous and decisive confrontation. The true nature of the shadow, I sensed, was about to be revealed, and its coils, I feared, were far tighter than we had ever imagined. Chapter 5. the serpent's coil tightens. The return journey to Fletcher Manor was undertaken with a sense of grim purpose that transcended the mere discomfort of the rattling train carriage. Holmes, his mind now a formidable engine of deduction, sat opposite me, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside, yet clearly seeing far beyond it. The revelations concerning the society of the Crimson Serpent, its ancient origins, and its insidious manipulation of the Finch family had transformed our investigation from a simple theft into a perilous confrontation with a deeply entrenched mystical order. My own heart, I confess, beat with a mixture of trepidation and a thrill of anticipation. The stakes had been raised immeasurably. "Watson," Holmes finally broke the silence, his voice low, "our adversary is not merely a common criminal, but an organization steeped in arcane lore, patient beyond measure, and utterly convinced of their righteous pursuit of power. They have cultivated this delusion within the Finch family for generations, waiting for the rubra mysterium to bloom, to be activated through consumption. Their ultimate goal, I suspect, extends far beyond the orchid itself." "What could be more valuable than such a unique specimen, Holmes?" I asked, perplexed. "Control, Watson," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "Control over the Finch line, control over Fletcher Manor, and perhaps control over the very secrets that this family unwittingly guards. The peril Lady Eleanor sensed, the crumbling tower and betrayal from within, were not mere delusions, but distorted echoes of a very real, very tangible threat. The society seeks to consolidate its power, and the Finches, I fear, are merely pawns in a much larger game." We arrived at Fletcher Manor as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the ancient stone with hues of bruised purple and melancholic grey. The manor, with its imposing silhouette against the fading light, seemed to exude a palpable sense of foreboding, its secrets now more keenly felt. Alistair Finch met us at the door, his face still etched with worry, though a flicker of hope ignited in his eyes at Holmes's return. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson, you have returned. Have you discovered anything further?" he asked, his voice strained. "Indeed, Mr. Finch," Holmes replied, his tone grave. "We have, and I fear the truth is far more unsettling than you could possibly imagine. We believe your family has been subjected to a long-standing, insidious manipulation by a clandestine organization, a society that seeks to exploit the very legends you dismissed as mere folklore." Finch blanched, his hand instinctively going to his chest. A society? But who? And why? "These are the questions we intend to answer tonight, Mr. Wirth." "Finch," Holmes stated, his gaze sweeping over the grand hall. "We believe this society has a hidden base, a secret chamber, perhaps even a network of tunnels beneath Fletcher Manor, a place from which they have observed and influenced your family for generations. And I believe the time for their next move is imminent." "A hidden base? Tunnels?" Finch stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But that's impossible. This house has been thoroughly explored, renovated even, over the centuries." "The most cunning secrets, Mr. Finch, are often hidden in plain sight, or in the very foundations upon which a family believes itself secure," Holmes countered. "Now I require your absolute discretion and cooperation. Tonight we shall set a trap, we shall observe, and we shall await the serpent's coil to tighten." Holmes then outlined his plan. He instructed Finch to ensure that all staff, particularly Craggs and Hemlock, believed that Holmes and I were merely conducting further inquiries into the orchid's disappearance, with no suspicion of a larger conspiracy. He also requested that Lady Eleanor be kept under close yet discreet observation, as her recent mental state made her vulnerable. "The key, Watson," Holmes whispered to me later, as we prepared for our nocturnal vigil in the shadows of the manor, "lies in understanding their pattern. They waited for the orchid to bloom. They manipulated Lady Eleanor to consume it. Now, what is their next logical step? To secure their influence, to perhaps eliminate any remaining obstacles, or to access something else that the Finches unknowingly possess." Our vigil began shortly after the manor settled into its nightly slumber. Holmes and I positioned ourselves in a darkened alcove overlooking the main staircase, a vantage point that allowed us to observe the comings and goings of any nocturnal visitors. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient timbers or the distant hoot of an owl. Hours passed, marked only by the slow, deliberate ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall below. just as the moon began its slow descent. Casting long, spectral shadows through the stained glass windows, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, barely audible above the beat of my own heart. I nudged Holmes, who was already alert, his head cocked, his eyes fixed on the shadows at the far end of the hall, near the entrance to the cellars. The sound grew slightly louder, a faint grinding, as if something heavy were being moved. Then a sliver of light appeared, emanating from what appeared to be a section of the wall near an old, unused fireplace. The light widened, revealing a narrow, almost invisible seam in the stone. "Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Our quarry stirs. Observe the method of entry. It speaks volumes." Slowly, carefully, a section of the stone wall slid inwards, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. From the depths of the passage, a figure emerged. It was a woman, slender and agile, her movements fluid and silent. Her hair, even in the dim light, possessed a distinct lightness, almost a silvery sheen. It was Miss Isolde Vane. She carried a small leather satchel, and her eyes, though shadowed, seemed to pierce the darkness with an unnerving intensity. She paused, her head turning slightly, as if sensing our presence, but then, with a swift, almost reptilian grace, she moved towards the main staircase. "Follow her, Watson," Holmes breathed, already moving with a silent swiftness that belied his earlier stillness. "But remain unseen. We must discover her objective." We shadowed Miss Vane through the silent corridors of Fletcher Manor. She moved with an intimate familiarity, as if she had traversed these paths countless times before. She did not head towards Lady Eleanor's chambers, nor Alistair Finch's. Instead, she ascended to the manor's upper floors, to a section of the house that had been largely unused for decades, a wing filled with forgotten portraits and shrouded furniture. She stopped before a large, ornate portrait of a stern-faced ancestor, its eyes seeming to follow her in the gloom. With a precise movement, she pressed a hidden catch on the frame. The portrait swung inwards, revealing another narrow, dark passage. "Good heavens, Holmes," I whispered. "Another secret passage." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming, "and one that suggests a deeper, more pervasive network. This is not merely a hidden room, but a clandestine route designed for regular though undetected access." Miss Vane slipped into the passage, and we followed, our footsteps muffled by the thick, ancient dust that coated the floor. The passage descended steeply, the air growing colder, heavier, and imbued with a faint, earthy scent, mingled with something else, a faint, almost metallic aroma, reminiscent of the rubra mysterium. The passage opened into a vast subterranean chamber, carved deep beneath the foundations of Fletcher Manor. It was a place of unsettling grandeur, its walls adorned with ancient, faded tapestries depicting coiled serpents and strange, blooming flowers. In the centre, a circular stone altar stood, upon which rested a single, exquisitely carved wooden box, its surface adorned with serpentine motifs. Around the altar, several figures, cloaked in dark, hooded robes, stood in a silent circle. Among them I immediately recognized the gaunt figure of Professor Alaric Thorne, his spectacles glinting in the flickering torchlight that illuminated the chamber. And beside him, a figure whose stern demeanour was unmistakable, even beneath the hood, Craggs, the butler. My blood ran cold. Craggs, the loyal, dependable butler, a servant of 30 years, was a member of this insidious society. The betrayal from within Lady Eleanor had sensed was far more literal than we had imagined. Miss Vane, now unhooded, approached the altar, her light hair a stark contrast to the dark robes of the others. She placed her satchel upon the stone, then opened it, revealing a collection of vials and instruments. "The essence has been extracted," she announced, her voice clear and resonant in the cavernous chamber. "The conduit has performed her duty. The rubra mysterium has yielded its power." Professor Thorne stepped forward, his voice, when he spoke, resonating with a chilling authority that was utterly unlike the academic rumble we had heard before. "Excellent, Isolde. The first phase is complete. The Finch line has been awakened. The path to the true source of power is now clear." "The true source of power?" Holmes whispered beside me, his eyes narrowed, his attention rapt. "Indeed, Professor," Craggs intoned, his voice devoid of its usual deference, now imbued with a cold, calculating authority. "The family has been weakened, their minds prepared. The ancient texts speak of a deeper wellspring of power, hidden within the very heart of Fletcher. a power that can only be accessed when the bloodline is primed by the orchid's influence. Thorn turned to face the robed figures. Brothers and sisters of the Crimson Serpent, for generations we have waited, for centuries we have cultivated the Finch line, guiding their susceptibility, nurturing their belief in the orchid's legend. Lady Seraphina was merely the first to truly awaken to its potential. Lady Eleanor, her descendant, has now completed the ritual. The veil between worlds is thin. The ancient power awaits. He then gestured towards the altar. The rubra mysterium, when consumed, opens the mind, not to foresight, but to receptivity. It makes the user a conduit, a vessel. Lady Eleanor, in her delusion, believed she was gaining insight. In truth, she was merely preparing herself and, by extension, the entire Finch bloodline for the ultimate transfer of power. Transfer of power? I whispered, my mind reeling. The power of the ancestral spirits, Watson, Holmes murmured back, his voice tight with tension. The very life force of the Finch line, to be drawn out and absorbed by this nefarious society. A ritual of ultimate vantage. His face impassive, his eyes fixed on the ritual. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the chamber. The stone walls seemed to hum with a nascent energy. They are attempting to draw the life force from the Finch family, Watson, Holmes whispered, his voice urgent. They are using Lady Eleanor as a focal point, a conduit to drain the very essence of the bloodline. We must act now. Before I could fully comprehend the horrifying implications, Holmes, with a sudden, decisive movement, stepped out from the shadows. "Professor Thorn," he declared, his voice ringing through the chamber, cutting through the eerie chanting. "Your ritual ends here?" The robed figures froze, their heads snapping towards us. Thorn's chanting ceased abruptly, and his head turned, his eyes, magnified by his spectacles, widening in shock. Isolde Vane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Craggs, however, remained impassive, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Holmes!" Thorn finally exclaimed, his voice now a furious roar, devoid of its earlier academic veneer. "How did you find this place?" "The threads of deceit, Professor, however intricately woven, always leave a loose end for the observant eye," Holmes replied, his voice calm, yet imbued with an undeniable authority. "The serpentine weaves silk, the Amazonian volcanic ash on Miss Vane's hair, the subtle inconsistencies in your own narrative, and the very obvious secret passage in the cellar, all led me to this subterranean lair, and to the true nature of your insidious society of the Crimson Serpent." Craggs, with a surprising swiftness, drew a small, ornate dagger from beneath his robes, its blade glinting wickedly in the torchlight. "Silence, meddler! You have stumbled into matters far beyond your comprehension." "On the contrary, Mr. Craggs," Holmes said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I comprehend perfectly. You are not merely a butler, but a long-serving agent of this society, placed within Fletcher Manor to observe and manipulate the Finch family. Your loyalty was merely a facade for your true, treacherous purpose." With a guttural cry, Craggs lunged forward, the dagger aimed at Holmes's chest. I instinctively moved to intervene, but Holmes was faster. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, he sidestepped the attack, then, using his cane, deftly hooked Craggs' ankle. The butler stumbled, crying out as he crashed to the stone floor, the dagger skittering away into the shadows. The other robed figures, roused from their shock, began to stir, some drawing similar daggers, others reaching for concealed weapons. Miss Vane, however, remained by the altar, her eyes fixed on the ancient tome, her face a mask of desperate determination. "Stop them, Isolde," Thorn commanded, his voice hoarse. "The ritual must be completed." Miss Vane, with a frantic movement, seized a small ornate chalice from the altar and poured the shimmering liquid from one of the vials into it. She then raised it to her lips. "No!" Holmes roared, lunging forward. "Watson, the chalice! She intends to consume the essence herself." I sprang into action, my medical bag forgotten. The robed figures, now fully engaged, moved to intercept us. One, a hulking brute, swung a heavy ornate staff at my head. I ducked, feeling the whoosh of air as it passed inches from my ear, and delivered a swift, well-aimed jab to his solar plexus, a trick I had learned in my army days. He grunted, stumbling back. Holmes, meanwhile, was engaged in a furious struggle with Professor Thorn. The botanist, despite his gaunt appearance, possessed a surprising strength, fueled, no doubt, by his fanatical devotion to the society. He grappled with Holmes, attempting to push him away from the altar, his eyes blazing with a mad zeal. "The power will be ours!" Thorn shrieked, his voice distorted by rage. "The Finch line will fall. The Crimson Serpent will rise." Just as Holmes managed to twist Thorn's arm, forcing him to release his grip, Miss Vane, her eyes wide and desperate, brought the chalice to her lips. "Isolde, no," Thorn cried, a note of desperation in his voice, but it was too late. She swallowed the shimmering liquid. For a moment she stood motionless, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on some unseen point. Then a shudder ran through her, her body convulsed, and she collapsed to the stone floor, the chalice clattering beside her. A profound silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the heavy breathing of Holmes and myself, and the groans of the fallen crags. The robed figures, momentarily stunned by Miss Vane's collapse, hesitated, their daggers poised. Holmes, ignoring the prone form of Thorn, rushed to Miss Vane's side. He knelt, his fingers pressing against her wrist. His face, usually so impassive, contorted with a rare expression of grim concern. "Watson!" he commanded, his voice sharp. "Her pulse is faint, rapid. The orchid's essence. It is a potent neurotoxin, not a mystical elixir. It has poisoned her." I immediately opened my medical bag, pulling out my instruments, my mind racing to recall antidotes for such a substance. But even as I worked, a terrible realization dawned upon me. The Society of the Crimson Serpent, in their deluded pursuit of power, had not only manipulated the Finch family, but had also unwittingly poisoned one of their own. The serpent, it seemed, had finally turned to consume itself. The robed figures, now seeing their comrade fallen and their leader subdued, began to waver. Their fanaticism, confronted with the stark reality of their poisoned accomplice, began to crumble. Holmes, ever the master of psychological warfare, seized the moment. "Your power has claimed one of your own," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Your essence is poison. Your society is built upon a foundation of lies and delusion." The words seemed to shatter the remaining resolve of the robed figures. With a collective gasp, they turned and fled, disappearing back into the secret passage from which they had emerged, their dark robes vanishing into the gloom. Thorn, now recovering, struggled to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of fury and despair. "Fools! Cowards! The ritual, it was so close!" Holmes ignored him, his full attention on Miss Vane. I worked frantically, attempting to administer what antidotes I could, but the effects of the orchid's essence were rapid and devastating. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin clammy. "It is too late, Watson," Holmes finally pronounced, his voice heavy with resignation. "The poison has taken hold. Her belief, her misguided devotion has claimed her life." Miss Isolde Vane, the brilliant botanist, the clandestine accomplice, lay still on the cold stone floor, a victim of the very power she had sought to harness. The grand ritual, the culmination of generations of manipulation, had ended not in triumph, but in tragedy. Holmes stood, his gaze sweeping over the silent, empty chamber, then resting on the ancient tome that lay open on the altar. "The Society of the Crimson Serpent, Watson," he said, his voice quiet. "Their grand design has crumbled, but the secrets of Fletcher Manor and the full extent of their influence remain to be fully unearthed. This, I fear, is but the beginning of the end." The true climax, I sensed, was yet to come. The serpent's coil had tightened, but it had not yet fully constricted. The battle was won, but the war against the lingering shadow of a dangerous delusion had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Uncoiling of the Serpent. The subterranean chamber, moments before a scene of frantic ritual and violent confrontation, now lay in a profound, almost eerie silence. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows upon the ancient tapestries, making the coiled serpents on the walls seem to rise with a malevolent light. His face a mask of furious despair, remained on the stone floor, subdued but not entirely defeated. Craggs, the butler, lay groaning, his ankle undoubtedly sprained from Holmes's deft manoeuvre. And Miss Isolde Vane, the brilliant botanist and misguided acolyte, lay tragically still beside the altar, a victim of the very power she had so desperately sought. My medical instincts, though futile, had compelled me to linger by Miss Vane's side, confirming what Holmes had already grimly pronounced. The orchid's essence, far from being a mystical elixir, was a potent, fast-acting neurotoxin. Her belief, her fanatical devotion to the Society of the Crimson Serpent, had led her to consume her own demise. It was a stark and horrifying testament to the dangers of blind faith and deluded ambition. Holmes, having satisfied himself that the immediate threat had dissipated with the flight of the robed figures, now turned his attention to Professor Thorne. He retrieved the ancient tome from the altar, its serpentine cover feeling cold and sinister beneath his touch. "Professor Thorne," Holmes stated, his voice devoid of triumph, yet imbued with an undeniable authority, "your grand design has crumbled. Your ancient power has proven to be nothing more than a deadly poison, and your Society of the Crimson Serpent is exposed." Thorne, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and fanaticism, spat, "You know nothing, meddler. The power, it is real. You have merely delayed the inevitable. The Finch line is primed. The veil is thin." "The Finch line, Professor, is merely susceptible to a hereditary delusion, exacerbated by your insidious manipulations," Holmes countered calmly. "Lady Seraphina's diary, which we discovered hidden in the cellars, reveals a pattern of madness, not mystical insight. The rubra mysterium does not grant foresight. It induces a powerful hallucinogenic state, preying upon the predisposed mind. You and your society have merely exploited this tragic vulnerability for your own nefarious ends." He then turned to Craggs, who was slowly attempting to push himself upright. "And you, Mr. Craggs, a loyal butler for 30 years, yet a viper in the bosom of the family. Your role, I presume, was to observe, to report, and to subtly influence the Finch family, particularly Lady Eleanor, towards the Society's ultimate goal." Craggs, his face contorted in a sneer, merely grunted. "The Finches are weak. They were always meant to be cold. The ancient power of Fletcher belongs to those strong enough to wield it." "The ancient power you speak of, Mr. Craggs," Holmes said, his voice hardening, "is nothing more than the collective life force of the Finch line, to be drained and absorbed by your society through a ritual of ultimate vampirism, a concept as barbaric as it is deluded." He then addressed both of them. "Your Society of the Crimson Serpent, I deduce, has been operating from this hidden chamber for generations. You have observed the Finch family, waiting for the rubra mysterium to bloom, knowing its hallucinogenic properties would induce the receptivity you sought. Lady Eleanor, in her fragile state, was the perfect conduit for your vile ritual." "But what was the ultimate goal, Holmes?" I interjected, still grappling with the full horror of their scheme, "beyond draining the Finch family's life force?" "Control, Watson," Holmes explained, his gaze sweeping over the ancient tapestries depicting coiled serpents and strange, blooming flowers. "Control over Fletcher Manor and its vast wealth. But more than that, I believe they sought to establish a new lineage, a new primed bloodline, through which they could perpetually draw upon this supposed ancient power. They believed that by consuming the orchid's essence, Miss Vane would become the ultimate conduit, a vessel for the accumulated life force of the Finch ancestors, a truly monstrous ambition." He then produced the light-coloured hair he had collected from Thorne's conservatory. This hair, Miss Vane's, found on the Nocturna Floris, revealed traces of Amazonian volcanic ash. This confirmed her recent travels and her connection to exotic flora. Her presence in Thorne's private conservatory on a night-blooming orchid indicated a clandestine meeting, a secret alliance between them. She was the Society's expert on the orchid's properties, perhaps even the one who refined the essence into its potent, albeit deadly, form. "And the silk fragment in Hemlock's shed?" I asked. "A deliberate plant, Watson," Holmes explained. "The serpentine weave silk, identical to the hair found in Lady Seraphina's locket, was intended to create a false trail. It was meant to implicate Hemlock, or at least to suggest a long-standing internal conspiracy within the Finch family, diverting our attention from the true external threat, the Society itself. It was a clever misdirection, designed to sow discord and confusion." He then turned to the ancient tome on the altar. "This book, I suspect, contains the Society's rituals, their twisted interpretations of the orchid's power, and perhaps a detailed history of their generations-long manipulation of the Finch family. It will provide us with the full extent of their depravity." Just then, a faint sound reached us from the secret passage, the sound of approaching footsteps. Alistair Finch, accompanied by several of his estate workers, emerged from the passage, their faces etched with concern. They had been alerted by the commotion, and had, with Holmes's earlier instructions, followed the secret passage to its source. Finch's eyes widened in horror as he took in the scene. The subterranean chamber, the robed figures, the prone forms of Thorne and Craggs, and the tragic stillness of Miss Vane. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed, rushing forward. What is the meaning of this, Mr. Holmes? Craggs, Thorne, and this poor woman?" Holmes, with a calm and measured tone, explained the full extent of the Society's treachery, revealing Thorne and Craggs as key members and the horrifying ritual they had attempted to perform. Finch listened, his face paling, his initial disbelief slowly giving way to a profound sense of betrayal and outrage. "Craggs, all these years," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And Thorne, a man I welcomed into my home. This is monstrous." He then turned to his estate workers. "Secure these men. They are traitors and villains. Send for the authorities at once." Thorne and Craggs, despite their earlier defiance, offered little resistance. Their grand scheme had unravelled, their fanatical belief shattered by the stark reality of Miss Vane's death and the exposure of their true motives. They were bound and led away, their dark robes now seeming pathetic and absurd in the harsh light of truth. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The local constabulary, initially bewildered by the extraordinary nature of the case, were eventually convinced by Holmes's meticulous evidence and the confession of Thorne and Craggs, who, once separated and interrogated, revealed the full extent of the Society's operations. It was indeed an ancient order, its members drawn from various walks of life, all united by a shared, deluded belief in the Rubra Mysterium's power and the ancient spirits of Fletcher Manor. Their network, while extensive, was ultimately fragile, built upon a foundation of secrecy and fanaticism that crumbled once exposed to the light of reason. Lady Eleanor, initially distraught by the revelation of her unwitting role in the Society's scheme, slowly began to recover. Under my care, and with the loving support of her brother, she gradually came to terms with the truth of her delusion. The serpentine shadow and betrayal from within were no longer terrifying visions, but the distorted echoes of a very real, very human treachery. The withered Rubra Mysterium, the catalyst for her madness, was carefully preserved as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked belief. Old Man Hemlock, initially under suspicion due to the silk fragment, was completely exonerated. The silk, it was discovered, had been subtly placed in his shed by Craggs, who had access to the entire manor and its grounds, as a deliberate attempt to misdirect our investigation. Hemlock, in his simple devotion to the Finch family and their botanical treasures, had been an unwitting pawn in the Society's elaborate game. Fletcher Manor, once a place of ancient secrets and lurking shadows, slowly began to shed its oppressive atmosphere. The secret passages were sealed, the subterranean chamber thoroughly explored and documented, its sinister artifacts removed. The Finch family, though scarred by the ordeal, emerged stronger, their bonds of kinship reinforced by the shared experience of confronting a common enemy. Our final evening at Fletcher Manor was a quiet affair. Holmes and I sat with Alistair Finch in the drawing-room, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth, casting a warm glow upon the scene. Lady Eleanor, though still frail, joined us for a brief period, her eyes now clear, her spirit slowly mending. "Mr. Holmes," Finch said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude, "I do not know how to thank you. You have saved my family, and perhaps our very sanity. The thought that such a monstrous conspiracy could have been operating beneath our very feet for generations, it is truly chilling." "The shadows, Mr. Finch, often lurk where we least expect them," Holmes replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "And the human mind, when susceptible to powerful delusions, can be a fertile ground for such insidious seeds to take root. Your family's history, combined with the unique properties of the Rubra Mysterium, made you a perfect target for the Society of the Crimson Serpent." "And Miss Vane?" Lady Eleanor asked softly, her voice still tinged with sadness. "She truly believed in the orchid's power?" "She did, Lady Eleanor," Holmes confirmed, his voice gentle. "Her scientific brilliance was tragically overshadowed by her fanatical devotion to the Society's twisted doctrines. She sought power, but found only oblivion." As we prepared to depart the next morning, leaving Fletcher Manor to its rightful peace, I reflected upon the extraordinary case. It had begun with a seemingly trivial theft, a vanished flower, and had led us into a labyrinth of ancient secrets, hereditary madness, and a clandestine society driven by a dangerous delusion. It was a testament to Holmes's unparalleled intellect, his unwavering logic, and his relentless pursuit of truth, however uncomfortable or improbable it might seem. "Another case closed, Holmes," I remarked as our hansom cab pulled away from the gates of Fletcher, leaving the ancient manor to its newfound tranquillity. "Indeed, Watson," he replied, a familiar glint in his eye. "And a most fascinating one. It reminds us, my dear fellow, that the most profound mysteries are often found not in the grand pronouncements of villains, but in the subtle whispers of human belief, and the insidious shadows that lurk within the human heart. The game, Watson, is always afoot, even when the serpent has been uncoiled." And with that, the great detective settled back, his gaze already distant, no doubt contemplating the next intricate puzzle that the vast, enigmatic city of London would inevitably present. Epilogue. The weeks that followed our departure from Fletcher Manor saw a gradual yet profound return to a semblance of order. The revelations of the Society of the Crimson Serpent sent ripples through certain obscure circles in London, though the official reports, carefully curated by Holmes and discreetly handled by Inspector Lestrade, presented a far more palatable narrative of a peculiar cult and its deluded leaders. Professor Alaric Thorne and Craggs, the butler, faced justice for their roles in the conspiracy, their fanatical beliefs offering little defence against the weight of Holmes's meticulous evidence. The fate of the other robed figures who had fled the subterranean chamber remained largely unknown, though Holmes surmised they would scatter, their organisation shattered by the exposure and the tragic demise of Miss Isolde Vane. Fletcher Manor itself underwent a quiet transformation. Alistair Finch, though deeply wounded by the betrayal, found a renewed sense of purpose in restoring his family's legacy. The secret passages were permanently sealed, the subterranean chamber consecrated and filled, its dark history buried once more beneath the earth. Lady Eleanor, under the compassionate care of her brother and the gentle guidance of a specialist I recommended, slowly regained her equilibrium. The rubra mysterium, now a dried, lifeless specimen, was enshrined in a glass case, a poignant reminder of the dangers of unchecked belief rather than a source of mystical power. She often spoke of the serpentine shadow, but now with a clarity that acknowledged it as a human evil, not a supernatural one. For my part, the case of the rubra mysterium left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder of the depths of human delusion and the insidious power of fanaticism. To witness such calculated manipulation, such a prolonged and patient scheme to exploit a family's vulnerabilities, was a chilling experience. It reinforced my conviction that the most monstrous evils often wear the most mundane disguises. One crisp November evening, as the gaslights flickered to life along Baker Street, casting their familiar glow upon our sitting room, I found Holmes in his usual armchair, his pipe emitting a fragrant plume of smoke. He was perusing a small leather-bound volume, its title, Ancient Botanical Lore and its Esoteric Interpretations, suggesting a lingering interest in the very subject that had consumed our recent weeks. "Watson," he mused, without looking up, "the human mind, in its boundless capacity for both reason and folly, remains the most fascinating subject of all. The Society of the Crimson Serpent, for all their elaborate rituals and ancient texts, were ultimately undone by a fundamental misunderstanding of the very power they sought. They mistook a neurotoxin for a divine elixir, a delusion for enlightenment." "A tragic irony, Holmes," I replied, stirring my tea. "Miss Vane's death, in particular, was a grim testament to their folly." "Indeed," he agreed, closing the book with a soft thud. "She was a brilliant mind, tragically ensnared by a dangerous fantasy. It serves as a potent reminder, Watson, that even the most astute intellects can be blinded by belief, particularly when that belief promises ultimate power or forbidden knowledge." He then leaned forward, a familiar glint in his eye. "The world, my dear fellow, is filled with such shadows, lurking in the forgotten corners of ancient houses, or within the very fabric of seemingly respectable societies. Our work, therefore, is never truly done. For as long as there are those who seek to exploit the vulnerabilities of others, who mistake superstition for science, or who pursue power through deceit, the game, Watson, will always be afoot." And with that, he rose, walked to the window, and gazed out at the bustling street below, his silhouette framed by the flickering gaslight, a vigilant guardian against the unseen shadows of London. I knew then that the Rubra Mysterium case, for all its chilling revelations, was but another chapter in the endless chronicle of human folly and the unyielding pursuit of truth. Our quiet life at Baker Street had resumed, but the echoes of the serpent's uncoiling would, I knew, linger in my memory for a very long time. Thank you so much for listening to our Honouring Audiobook's original Sherlock Holmes adventure. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.